Hey, tonight we are going somewhere that almost nobody goes when they talk about history. Not Rome, not Greece, not Egypt, not the Vikings, who have had quite enough documentaries at this point and are probably tired. Tonight, we go to Baghdad, to a city that at its height was home to over 1 million people, in a world where most cities held 10,000. To a civilization that for roughly 500 years was the most intellectually productive place on Earth.
A place where scholars translated every book they could find in any language. Where hospitals had medical wards organized by condition. Where astronomers mapped the sky with instruments of extraordinary precision. Where a man built a clock powered by water that told the time, played music, and moved mechanical figures in the year 1206. Tonight, we go to the Islamic Golden Age.
And I want to be clear about what I mean by that phrase before we begin, because it is a phrase that gets used and then quickly moved past, as though the Golden Age is a historical fact to be acknowledged and filed, rather than a world to be entered slowly and understood properly. What I mean is this. For approximately 500 years, from roughly the 8th century to the 13th century CE, the Islamic world was the center of human intellectual life. Not one of the centers, the center.
The place where mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, chemistry, engineering, geography, and literature were being advanced faster and more systematically than anywhere else on Earth. The place whose scholars preserved the knowledge of ancient Greece when Europe had largely lost access to it. The place that invented algebra, that gave us the algorithm, that named the stars, that described the circulatory system of the human body centuries before European medicine arrived at the same conclusion. This is not revisionist history.
This is simply history that did not make it into the curriculum most of us received, for reasons that are themselves worth thinking about at some point, though perhaps not at this hour of the night. For now, dim the lights. Let the room settle. Pull something comfortable around you, and let your breathing find its own pace. History in sleep is here, and tonight, the House of Wisdom is open. Come in. The thing about the Islamic Golden Age is that it began, in the way that the best things sometimes begin, with a decision to read everything. In the 8th century CE, the Abbasid Caliphate came to power in the Islamic world, displacing the Umayyad dynasty that had preceded it, and moving the capital of the Caliphate from Damascus to a new city that they built from scratch on the banks of the Tigris River. They called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. The rest of the world came to know it as Baghdad. The second Abbasid Caliph, al-Mansur, chose the site personally. He reportedly sent teams to test the climate and the soil before committing to the location, which tells you something about the administrative seriousness with which he approached the project of building a capital. He did not simply point at a piece of ground and say, "Put it there." He gathered information first. He made a considered decision. He was, in other words, already operating in the spirit that would define the civilization he was founding. Baghdad was built in a circle, a perfect circle, or as close to one as 8th century engineering could achieve, which was considerably close. A circular city with a diameter of approximately 2.5 kilometers, surrounded by double walls with a moat, 4 gates placed at the cardinal compass points, and at its center the Caliph's palace and the Great Mosque. This circular plan was not merely aesthetic, it was a philosophical statement. The circle had no beginning and no end. Every point on its circumference was equidistant from the center. It was a geometry of equality and of order, the ideal shape for a city that intended to be the center of everything. The city filled quickly.
Within a generation of its founding, Baghdad was one of the largest cities in the world. By the 9th century, it had a population estimated at somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people, at a time when the largest cities in Western Europe might hold 20,000 or 30,000. This is not a small difference. This is a difference in kind.
Baghdad in the 9th century was to London or Paris of the same period what a modern metropolitan city is to a large market town. What made Baghdad more than simply large was what happened inside it, intellectually. The caliphs of the early Abbasid period had an unusual characteristic for rulers of any era. They were genuinely, personally curious. Al-Mansur, his grandson, Harun al-Rashid, the caliph who features in the stories of the 1001 Nights, which tells you something about the quality of legend that attached itself to this period.
Al-Rashid's son, Al-Mamun, who would go furthest of all in institutionalizing the intellectual project. These were not rulers who collected scholars the way other rulers collected gold or horses as passive prestige objects. They read. They corresponded with scholars. They had opinions about theology and philosophy and mathematics that they were prepared to defend in debate. Al-Mamun reportedly dreamed of Aristotle and woke up determined to find every text the Greek philosopher had written, which, when you are the caliph of the most powerful state in the world, is a dream you have considerable resources to act on.
The translation movement that followed was one of the most consequential intellectual projects in human history, and one of the least celebrated outside specialist academic circles. Beginning in earnest under Harun al-Rashid and accelerating dramatically under al-Mamun, scholars working in Baghdad systematically translated into Arabic virtually every significant text they could locate in Greek, Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and other languages. The works of Aristotle, of Plato, of Euclid and Pythagoras, the medical writings of Galen and Hippocrates, the astronomical works of Ptolemy, the mathematical texts of Diophantus, Persian scientific and administrative literature, Indian mathematics, including the number system and the concept of zero that would eventually transform all of human calculation. Every book that anyone had written about anything that seemed worth knowing was tracked down, acquired through purchase or diplomatic request or outright copying, and rendered into Arabic by teams of translators, working with a methodical ambition that has no real precedent in the ancient or medieval world. The Greeks themselves had done something similar, absorbed the knowledge of Egypt and Babylon and Persia, and synthesized it into their own intellectual tradition. The Romans had absorbed the Greeks. But neither project had been this systematic, this deliberately institutional, this explicitly committed to comprehensiveness. The Abbasid translation movement was not scholars stumbling across interesting texts. It was a state-sponsored program of total intellectual acquisition, funded by the Caliphate and carried out by some of the most skilled translators who had ever lived. Many of these translators were Christians, Arab Christians, Syriac Christians, Nestorian Christians, who had been keeping Greek texts alive in their monasteries in the Eastern Roman world for centuries. They brought those texts to Baghdad. They translated them. They were paid generously for the work.
And the Arabic translations they produced became the versions of these ancient texts that were then read, studied, commented upon, and dramatically extended by the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. This is not a small irony. The preservation of Greek knowledge, which European civilization would eventually rediscover in the 12th century through Latin translations of Arabic translations, was substantially the work of Christian scholars employed by Muslim caliphs in a city that had not existed 50 years before. History is rarely as simple as any one group's preferred version of it.
The Abbasid caliphs paid translators by the weight of the books they produced. Not by the page, not by the word, by the weight. gold equivalent to the weight of the translated manuscript. This was a payment system that strongly incentivized thorough, complete, meticulous translation. It also, if you think about it, incentivized slightly heavier paper. But the translators appeared to have been, on the whole, too professionally serious to exploit this particular loophole. What the translation movement created over the course of about a century was something that had never existed before in human history.
A single language, Arabic, that contained in translation or in original composition essentially all of the significant intellectual work of every major civilization that had preceded it. Greek philosophy and science, Persian administrative and literary knowledge, Indian mathematics and astronomy, Babylonian and Egyptian tradition filtered through Persian and Greek synthesis. One language, one city at its center, one institutional project. And then, the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age sat down with all of it, read it, argued with it, corrected it, extended it, and built something new. That is what the next 500 years were.
What made the decision to read everything unusual was not just its ambition, but its timing. The early Abbasid caliphs came to power in a world that had recently undergone the single largest expansion of a political and religious system in human history. Within roughly a century of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the Islamic world had expanded from the Arabian Peninsula to encompass the Persian Empire, Egypt, North Africa, the Levant, Spain, and large portions of Central Asia.
This was an expansion that moved faster than any comparable historical process, faster than Rome's expansion, faster than Alexander's, accomplished in a shorter time over a larger geography. The speed had consequences. The Islamic world had absorbed, within a few generations, the material legacy of the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east, two of the most administratively sophisticated and intellectually developed civilizations of the late ancient world.
In the libraries of Alexandria, in the monasteries of Syria, in the palace archives of Ctesiphon, in the philosophical schools of Persia, there was an enormous accumulated inheritance waiting to be processed. The Abbasids chose to process it. This was not an inevitable choice. Conquerors in the ancient and medieval world more commonly destroyed than preserved, and when they preserved, it was usually by accident rather than policy.
The Abbasid decision to systematically absorb the intellectual legacy of the civilizations they had superseded was a choice made by specific individuals, supported by specific institutions, funded by a specific political system that had the resources and, crucially, the inclination to invest in knowledge for its own sake. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent ambassadors to the Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros I with a specific brief: identify manuscripts of Greek scientific and philosophical texts and arrange for their acquisition. This was not a military mission. It was a book-buying mission conducted at the highest diplomatic level.
The caliph of the most powerful state in the world was personally directing foreign policy toward the acquisition of ancient academic texts. Consider that for a moment. A head of state sending ambassadors abroad specifically to buy old books. The manuscripts came back. They went to the translators. The translators worked in teams. The translated texts went to the library. The scholars read the library. And the scholars, the generation that read everything that had been accumulated, produced the Golden Age. There was also a material foundation that tends to get overlooked in accounts that focus on the intellectual drama of the translation movement. Baghdad's economic wealth was extraordinary. The Abbasid Caliphate controlled the most productive agricultural land in the Middle East. The Mesopotamian river plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, irrigated for centuries and capable of producing enormous agricultural surpluses.
It controlled the major trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to India and China. The taxes and duties that flowed through Baghdad were on a scale that made sustained, lavish patronage of scholarship not merely possible, but for a caliphate that understood the connection between intellectual prestige and political legitimacy, almost obligatory. Scholars were paid in Baghdad generously.
In a world where most scholars scraped by on the margins of agricultural economies, being a scholar in early Abbasid Baghdad meant receiving a salary, having access to a library, and being part of an intellectual community of a density and quality found nowhere else on earth. Talented people from across the Islamic world and beyond came to Baghdad because that was where the intellectual life was, where the money was, where the books were, where the conversations were happening. The brain drain of the medieval world flowed toward Baghdad.
And the Golden Age was what happened when you concentrated that much talent in one place with adequate resources and a patron who understood what they were for. In 830 CE, the Caliph al-Ma'mun established in Baghdad an institution that has no entirely satisfying equivalent in the modern world, because it was several things simultaneously that we now think of as separate. It was a library. It was a translation bureau. It was a research institute. It was an observatory. It was an academy where scholars gathered to debate and collaborate.
It had a director, a permanent staff, a substantial annual budget, and a collection that eventually numbered in the hundreds of thousands of volumes. The Arabs called it Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. The name is not metaphorical. It is not a poetic way of describing the general atmosphere of intellectual life in Baghdad.
It was a specific institution with a specific address, with rooms dedicated to specific functions: translation rooms, reading rooms, astronomical observation platforms, administrative offices for the management of what was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious institutional intellectual projects in the history of the world up to that point. Al-Ma'mun funded it generously. When he sent diplomatic envoys to the Byzantine Empire, part of their brief was to bring back manuscripts, scientific
and philosophical texts still held in the libraries of Constantinople that had not yet made their way to Baghdad. When he learned of a significant collection of Greek texts held somewhere, he arranged for access to them. The House of Wisdom was the institutional expression of his personal conviction that knowledge, all knowledge, from every source about every subject, was worth having. The scholars who worked there were not a homogeneous group. They were Arab, Persian, Syriac Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian. They came from across the vast geography of the Islamic world and from beyond its borders.
They worked in Arabic as the common intellectual language, as medieval European scholars would use Latin, but they brought with them the traditions and learning of a dozen different cultures. The House of Wisdom was, in this respect, a remarkable experiment in institutionalized intellectual diversity, not as an ideological position, but as a practical method. More traditions meant more knowledge. More knowledge meant more to work with.
The director of the House of Wisdom under Al-Ma'mun was a man named Yahya ibn Masawayh, a Syriac Christian physician whose family had been involved in the translation movement for a generation before the House of Wisdom was formally established. Under his directorship, the institution expanded rapidly. Translation work proceeded in organized teams. A scholar who read Greek would produce a rough translation. A second scholar who also knew Greek would check it. An Arabic stylist would polish the language. The result was translations of unusual reliability and readability. This is worth pausing on.
These were not translations made by a single scholar working alone and hoping for the best. These were translations made by collaborative teams with a quality control process.
in the 9th century, in an institution explicitly designed for the purpose. The level of methodological sophistication is honestly startling. The most famous scholar associated with the House of Wisdom, the one whose name has survived most completely into the modern world, was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He worked there in the early 9th century under al-Mamun's patronage.
He wrote a treatise on a branch of mathematics that had not previously existed as a formal discipline. He called it Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. The word al-Jabr from that title became, in Latin translation, algebra. Al-Khwarizmi also wrote a text explaining the Indian numeral system, including the concept of zero, which the Indians had developed and which the Islamic world adopted and transmitted westward.
The Latin translation of this text was so widely used in medieval Europe that its author's name became the word for the procedures it described. The Latinized form of al-Khwarizmi's name, algorithmi, became the word algorithm. Algebra, algorithm, both words, both concepts, from one scholar, working in
one institution, in Baghdad, in the 9th century. The House of Wisdom also maintained astronomical observation facilities because the Islamic religious calendar depended on accurate astronomical observation. The beginning of each month was marked by the sighting of the new moon, and accurate prediction of this required serious observational astronomy. The combination of religious necessity and intellectual curiosity produced an astronomical tradition that advanced the field dramatically. Al-Mamun commissioned 2 groups of scholars to measure the circumference of the Earth.
Not to determine whether the Earth was round. The spherical Earth was accepted in the Islamic intellectual tradition without controversy, inherited from the Greek mathematical tradition, but to measure it precisely. 2 teams went out into the Syrian desert, measured a degree of arc along a meridian using careful astronomical observation, and multiplied. Their result, approximately 40,253 kilometers, compares favorably with the modern measurement of 40,075 kilometers. In 820 CE, in the desert, without satellites, without GPS, without any instrument more sophisticated than a carefully made astrolabe and a very long measuring rope. The error was less than 0.5%. The books accumulated in the House of Wisdom. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to use the collection. They read, they annotated, they wrote their own works in the margins, and then in separate books. They argued with the ancient authorities, not reverentially accepting everything Aristotle or Galen or Ptolemy had written, but checking it against observation and experiment and their own reasoning and correcting it when it was wrong. This last point matters. The Islamic Golden Age scholars were not merely transmitters of ancient knowledge.
They were critics of it, correctors of it, extenders of it. When Ibn al-Haytham, in the 11th century, read the ancient Greek accounts of how vision worked, that the eye projected rays outward to sense the world, he performed experiments, found the theory impossible to support, and proposed instead that light entered the eye from outside. He was right. Aristotle was wrong. And Ibn al-Haytham said so, carefully, with evidence. The House of Wisdom burned in 1258, when the Mongols sacked Baghdad. The books went into the Tigris River.
The river ran dark, according to contemporary accounts, with the ink of centuries. But by then, the knowledge had already spread. The translations had been copied. The original works had been read and recopied across the Islamic world, from Spain to Central Asia. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. What it had produced was not. You cannot burn an idea that has already been thought by 1,000 people in 100 cities. The House of Wisdom understood this
in its own way, even if it could not have anticipated the specific form its destruction would take. It had spent 400 years ensuring that what it held was not
Held only by it. That was the point of a library. That was always the point. The physical space of the House of Wisdom grew over the decades into something considerably larger than a library in any simple sense. The institution had its own buildings within the palace complex of Baghdad. It had residential quarters for scholars who lived and worked there full-time.
It had copying rooms where scribes reproduced texts with the painstaking care that manuscript reproduction requires. A good scribe could produce several pages of careful text per day, which meant that creating a single copy of a large work like Aristotle's complete philosophical writings was a project that might take months and required significant resources. The copying of texts was itself an intellectual activity, not merely a mechanical one.
Scribes, who were themselves scholars, would note discrepancies between the copy they were working from and other versions they had read, add marginal annotations where the text was unclear, and occasionally produce brief commentaries on passages they found particularly significant or problematic. The manuscripts that emerged from the House of Wisdom were not passive repositories. They were active, annotated, argued with objects that bore the traces of every scholar who had worked with them. The scholars themselves occupied an unusual social position in Abbasid Baghdad. They were respected, they were housed and fed and paid. They moved between the palace and the city. They knew each other, argued with each other, occasionally wrote polemics against each other's theories, collaborated on large projects that no single scholar could have completed alone. Al-Kindi, the first major Arab philosopher who worked in the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, is an example of the range that the Golden Age required and produced. He wrote on philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, physics, medicine, music, linguistics, and geography. He is said to have produced around 260 works in his lifetime. Whether this number is precisely accurate is uncertain, but the range is not. Al-Kindi genuinely worked across multiple disciplines because the intellectual project of his era was not specialized in the modern sense. It was synthesizing. It was asking, what do we know from all available sources, and what does it add up to? This is a question that requires someone who has actually read all available sources. Al-Kindi appears to have done this to a degree that later ages would find impossible, because there was simply more to read. The mathematical achievements that flowed from the House of Wisdom and its intellectual environment extended well beyond Al-Khwarizmi's founding contributions. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra was taken up and extended by subsequent scholars. Thabit ibn Qurra, a Sabian from Haran, who translated Greek mathematical texts and produced significant original work, extended the theory of amicable numbers, pairs of numbers where each is the sum of the proper divisors of the other. He found a formula for generating them that went beyond anything the Greeks had produced and anticipated results that European mathematicians would not arrive at independently until the 17th century. Ibn al-Haytham's Kitab al-Manazir, the Book of Optics, was a complete theory of visual perception, grounded in experiment rather than authority. He built what we would now recognize as a camera obscura, a darkened chamber with a small hole that projects an inverted image of the outside world onto the opposite wall, and used it to demonstrate the rectilinear travel of light. He studied the behavior of light in lenses and mirrors. He worked on the mathematics of refraction. He identified the structure of the eye and the roles of its different components in vision. His book was translated into Latin in the 13th century and was a primary source for European optics until the 17th century, a period of over 400 years, during which European scholars were working from a text produced in Cairo in the early 11th century. The House of Wisdom was not merely a repository, but a generator.
The scholars who passed through it or were formed by the intellectual culture it represented did not simply pass on what the ancients had known. They added to it, corrected it, and sometimes completely replaced it with something better.
That is what we mean when we say it was an age of science. Not that science in the modern institutional sense existed. It did not. And it is unhelpful to project the modern research university backward into the 9th century.
What we mean is that the scholars of the Golden Age understood that the world could be understood through observation and reason, that received authority was not immune from empirical challenge, and that the proper response to a question was to look carefully and think rigorously, rather than to appeal to what a famous person had said about it several hundred years ago. That attitude, look carefully, think rigorously, be willing to say the famous person was wrong, is the attitude of science. It was practiced in Baghdad in the 9th century.
It was not reinvented in Europe from scratch in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was transmitted through Latin translations of Arabic texts from the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age to the European scholars who built on their foundations and called the results a scientific revolution. The House of Wisdom trained the people who trained the people who produced the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. This is not a small thing to have done. In the year 970 CE, a hospital opened in Cairo that had wards organized by medical condition. This sentence requires a moment of stillness to absorb. Not a general treatment room where the sick went to be treated as a category. Wards. Specific wards for specific conditions. A ward for febrile illnesses. A ward for surgical cases. A ward for eye conditions.
A ward for patients recovering after treatment, which is to say, a ward that understood that recovery was a distinct medical phase requiring specific conditions. This was the Bimaristan al-Mansouri, and it was not even the most advanced hospital operating in the medieval Islamic world at the time.
The Islamic tradition of medicine is one of the Golden Age's most remarkable achievements and one of its most consequential legacies, because it did not merely preserve the ancient medical knowledge it inherited from Hippocrates, from Galen, from Persian and Indian medical traditions. It substantially improved upon all of it, and then created a new professional infrastructure for its application that Europe would not develop for several more centuries.
The Bimaristan, the Persian word for hospital, from bimar, sick person, and stan, place, was an institution of the medieval Islamic world that has no exact equivalent in the medieval Christian world. European hospitals of the same period were primarily charitable institutions, places where the poor sick were cared for by religious orders, where prayer was as central as medicine, where the model was compassionate tending rather than systematic treatment. The Islamic Bimaristan was a medical institution. It was staffed by physicians. It had treatment protocols. It distinguished between different categories of illness. It performed surgeries.
It kept records. The Al-Nuri Bimaristan in Damascus, founded in the 12th century, had separate wards for men and women. It had a pharmacological dispensary. It had running water in every ward. At a time when running water in a medical facility was not a matter of bacterial theory, which had not yet been developed, but of the Islamic religious and cultural emphasis on cleanliness that turned out, entirely by coincidence with modern germ theory, to produce considerably better medical outcomes than the alternatives.
The physician Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, one of the great Latinizations of Arabic names that tells you how completely Islamic medicine was eventually absorbed into European medicine, wrote in the early 11th century a work called Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, the Canon of Medicine. It was a comprehensive, systematic account of medical knowledge as it existed in his time, organized with a logical rigor and completeness that the ancient medical texts had
not achieved. It covered general medical theory, simple medical substances listed alphabetically, diseases organized by the organ system they affected, conditions not specific to any single organ, and compound medicines. The canon of medicine remained a primary medical textbook in both the Islamic world and European universities, where it was read in Latin translation for over 600 years. 600 years! It was still being used as a teaching text at the University of Montpellier in France in the 17th century, by which point it was roughly 600 years old.
For context, imagine a textbook written in 1425 still being considered current and useful in 2025. What made it so durable was not that it was merely comprehensive, though it was extraordinarily comprehensive, but that it was correct about a great many things that took European medicine centuries more to arrive at. Ibn Sina described what we now call the blood-brain barrier. He proposed that bodily secretions could transmit disease between people, a proto-theory of contagion that preceded the European germ theory of disease by 8 centuries.
He identified the role of soil and water in spreading disease. He described the symptoms of diabetes with clinical precision. He performed controlled experiments with placebos when testing the efficacy of treatments. Controlled experiments with placebos in the early 11th century. Al-Razi, Latinized as Rhazes, preceded Ibn Sina by about a century and was, if anything, a more rigorous experimentalist. Working in Baghdad and then in his native Rai in Persia, he produced medical works of remarkable breadth and precision.
His Kitab al-Hawi, the comprehensive book, was the largest medical encyclopedia produced in the medieval world, filling 23 volumes. He was the first physician in history to clinically distinguish between smallpox and measles, observing both diseases carefully and recording the differential symptoms with the specificity of someone who understood that accurate diagnosis was the foundation of effective treatment. He was also, characteristically, skeptical of authority. He wrote a book called Doubts About Galen, which is exactly what it sounds like. A systematic, critical examination of the ancient Greek physicians' theories, identifying where observation contradicted received wisdom, and arguing, with evidence, that Galen was wrong. This was not a small act of intellectual courage in a world that regarded ancient authorities with considerable reverence. Al-Razi said, respectfully, that Galen had made errors. Here is the evidence. Here is what the evidence suggests instead. The hospitals maintained by the Islamic Golden Age were also noteworthy for something that sounds, in retrospect, obvious, but was far from universal in the medical world of the time. They treated patients regardless of religion or wealth. The Bimaristan model included free treatment for those who could not pay. Patients were not turned away on grounds of faith. A Christian, a Jew, Zoroastrian, all were treated. This was partly theological, reflecting the Islamic emphasis on care for the sick as religious duty. It was also partly practical. Sick people do not sort neatly by religious category, and a medical institution that operated on theological exclusion would have served its stated medical purpose poorly. Some hospitals provided post-discharge support, money or goods given to patients on release so that they would not have to return to work immediately and could complete their recovery at home. There are records of hospitals sending physicians to visit patients who had been discharged, of hospitals maintaining pharmacies that produced medicines under physician supervision rather than leaving patients to obtain whatever an apothecary happened to have available. The record of a 9th century Baghdad hospital includes a notation of the diet prescribed to a specific patient, what he was to eat, in what quantity, at what intervals. Because the Islamic medical tradition had inherited and considerably extended the ancient Greek understanding that food was medicine, that what a recovering patient consumed was as medically significant as what drugs they were given. Diet as medicine, contagion theory,
clinical trials, organized medical wards, specialized physicians,
Post-discharge care, free treatment for the poor. In the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. In a world where, in many other places, the primary medical treatment for serious illness was prayer and the application of various substances whose connection to the patient's actual condition was largely theological. The hospitals of the Islamic Golden Age were not perfect. They operated within the medical understanding of their time, which had significant limits and significant errors. But they were, by any honest historical measure, approximately 4 to 6 centuries ahead of their nearest institutional equivalents in the medieval Christian world.
This is worth knowing, not as a point of cultural competition, which is a tedious and unproductive game, but because the history of medicine is the history of human beings trying, with varying degrees of success and sophistication, to keep each other alive. And the Islamic Golden Age physicians tried harder, more systematically, and with more success than most people in the modern world have ever been told.
The hospitals of the Islamic Golden Age were also the site of something that we now consider a fundamental principle of medical education, but that was, in the medieval period, far from universal: clinical training. The Bimaristan was not merely a place where sick people were treated. It was a place where physicians learned their craft by treating sick people under supervision, seeing the actual progression of diseases through their stages, and comparing observed symptoms with what the medical texts described.
Al-Razi, who directed the Bimaristan in Baghdad, reportedly used the hospital explicitly as a teaching institution. He is described as walking through the wards with students, examining patients, explaining his diagnostic reasoning, and demonstrating procedures. This is what we now call bedside teaching. It has been the standard method of clinical medical education for the past century and a half in the Western world. Al-Razi was doing it in Baghdad in the 9th century. He also did something that sounds, in retrospect, almost shockingly modern. When deciding where to locate a new hospital in Baghdad, he reportedly hung pieces of fresh meat in different parts of the city and waited to see where the meat decayed most slowly. The location where it lasted longest, he reasoned, had the cleanest air and was therefore the healthiest site for a medical institution. This is not germ theory. Al-Razi did not know about bacteria or about the relationship between air quality and pathogen concentration, but the method, using empirical observation to answer a practical question about health and environment, is the method of science.
He was right, as it happens, in the sense that areas with cleaner air do tend to have lower pathogen loads, even if the mechanism by which this is true was not accessible to 9th century medical knowledge. He did the experiment. He looked at what happened. He drew the conclusion the evidence supported. The ophthalmological tradition within Islamic medicine deserves particular mention because it represents one of the areas of greatest Golden Age achievement and one of the most consequential medical legacies.
The human eye was a subject of intense scholarly attention in the medieval Islamic world, combining the interests of physicians who treated eye diseases, opticians who ground lenses, astronomers who depended on clear vision for their observations, and mathematicians who studied the geometry of light. Ali ibn Isa al-Kahal, the Kuhli, or oculist, wrote in the early 11th century a comprehensive treatise on ophthalmology that described 130 distinct eye conditions and their treatments. He described cataracts and their surgical removal with a needle, couching, the oldest known cataract surgery technique. He described glaucoma, though without the full modern understanding of its mechanism. He described procedures for treating conditions of the eyelid, the cornea, and the orbit. Cataract surgery with a needle in the 11th century. The technique, inserting a needle through the outer layer of the eye to displace the clouded lens,
was performed under conditions we would now consider extreme, without anesthesia or sterile instruments in the modern sense, and the outcomes were variable. But the surgery was performed. Blind people had their sight partially or fully restored by it.
People who had lived in darkness received light. The pharmacological tradition of the Islamic Golden Age was equally sophisticated. Al-Biruni's Kitab al-Saydana, the Book of Pharmacy and Materia Medica, cataloged hundreds of medicinal substances, giving their names in multiple languages, describing their properties and medical uses, distinguishing carefully between substances that were commonly confused, and providing quality control guidance for identifying adulterated or degraded materials. Ibn al-Baytar, writing in the 13th century, produced a comprehensive botanical and pharmacological encyclopedia that described approximately 1,400 medical substances, plants, minerals, and animal products, of which around 300 were newly described by him, not found in any earlier source.
He had traveled extensively to collect his specimens, visiting North Africa, Spain, the Levant, and Anatolia, observing plants in their natural habitats and talking to local practitioners about their traditional uses. Fieldwork in the 13th century for a pharmacological encyclopedia, traveling to observe the plants himself rather than relying on what earlier texts said about them. The Islamic Golden Age pharmaceutical tradition was the direct ancestor of the European pharmacopoeia that developed in the late medieval and early modern period.
The drugs, the preparation methods, the quality standards, the systematic cataloging, all of this reached European medicine through Arabic medical texts, through the translation movement that moved in the reverse direction from the 12th century onward, as European scholars in Toledo and Sicily and elsewhere translated Arabic texts into Latin and brought the Islamic medical tradition into the European university curriculum.
They had to learn it themselves through observation and experiment and the honest willingness to say, even about Galen, even about Hippocrates, even about the most respected ancient authorities, this is wrong. Here is the evidence. Here is what actually happens. That kind of knowledge, earned rather than inherited, checked against observation rather than accepted on faith, is the hardest kind to acquire and the most valuable kind to have. They had it. Look up tonight if the sky is clear where you are.
Or simply imagine it. The sky as it would have been seen from the roof of a house in 9th century Baghdad, unpolluted by electric light. The Milky Way visible as a river of pale luminosity. The stars sharp and plentiful in the desert air. The names you would have used for what you saw, if you had learned them in an English-speaking astronomy class, are Arabic. Almost all of them. Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Vega, Altair, Deneb, Fomalhaut, Algol, Achernar, Zuban el-Janubi, which is admittedly a lot of name for a single star, but is Arabic nonetheless.
Of the modern Western star names that are not Greek, and there are many, the overwhelming majority are Arabic, derived from the names given to them.
Stars by Islamic astronomers during the Golden Age, who observed them so carefully and cataloged them so thoroughly that their nomenclature became the international standard and has remained so ever since. The Arabic star names are often descriptions. Aldebaran means the follower. It follows the Pleiades across the sky. Betelgeuse is from Yad al-Jawza, the hand of the giant. Rigel from Rigel Jawza al-Yusra, the left leg of the giant. These are not arbitrary labels.
They are the residue of a tradition of careful, systematic, sustained observation that named what it saw in terms of what it looked like and where it sat in relation to everything else. Islamic astronomy during the Golden Age was the most advanced in the world, This is not a qualified or hedged statement. From the 8th century to at least the 13th, no other astronomical tradition on Earth was producing more accurate measurements, more sophisticated theoretical models, or more practically useful tables of celestial positions than the astronomers working in the Islamic world.
The reasons were both religious and intellectual. The Islamic religious calendar was lunar. The months began with the new moon, and the exact timing of prayers was determined by the position of the sun. This created a standing practical requirement for accurate astronomical observation and calculation that the Greek tradition, for all its theoretical sophistication, had not faced in quite the same institutional and daily way. Islamic astronomy was not a purely abstract pursuit. It was religiously necessary. And that necessity drove sustained investment and institutional support.
The astrolabe, an ancient instrument inherited from the Greeks, was dramatically refined by Islamic astronomers into a precision tool of extraordinary versatility. With an astrolabe, you could determine the time from the height of the sun or a known star. You could find the direction of Mecca from any location on Earth, which was a religious obligation. You could measure the altitude of celestial objects, calculate the date, and solve a range of mathematical problems that would otherwise require lengthy computation.
The Islamic improvements to the astrolabe in the 9th and 10th centuries produced an instrument so useful that it remained the primary navigational and astronomical tool of European sailors and astronomers until the 17th century. Al-Battani, known in the Latin West as Alba Tegnius, the naming conventions being consistent, worked in the late 9th and early 10th centuries and produced astronomical measurements of remarkable precision. He calculated the length of the solar year as 365 days, 5 hours, 46 minutes, and 24 seconds. The modern value is 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 45 seconds.
His error was less than 3 minutes in a year. He determined the inclination of the Earth's ecliptic, the tilt of the Earth's axis relative to its orbit, and got it right to within a fraction of a degree. He discovered that the position of the sun's apogee, its farthest point from the Earth, had shifted since Ptolemy's time, which meant that the solar system was not the static, unchanging mechanism that Ptolemy's model implied. This was not an idle observation. If the solar system was changing, if the movements of the bodies within it shifted over time in measurable ways, then the ancient astronomical tables were not permanently reliable. They needed to be updated.
And the Islamic astronomical tradition maintained over several centuries the sustained program of careful observation that made this kind of detection of slow celestial change possible. The Zij, astronomical table, was a core product of Islamic astronomy, a comprehensive set of calculated positions for the sun, moon, and known planets, compiled from systematic observation over years or decades, and used to calculate the position of any celestial body at any time. Multiple astronomers across the Islamic world produced Zijs of varying scope and accuracy.
The most comprehensive and influential were themselves remarkable achievements of sustained mathematical and observational work. Ibn al-Haytham, the physician and mathematician we encountered earlier, who correctly understood that vision worked by light entering the eye rather than the eye projecting rays outward, also wrote extensively on astronomy. His Doubts on Ptolemy was a systematic critique of the Ptolemaic astronomical model, identifying mathematical inconsistencies in the model and arguing that any correct astronomical theory must be not merely mathematically consistent, but physically plausible.
He was demanding, in the 11th century, what we would now call a physically realistic model. He was working towards something like a modern scientific standard of explanation, in which mathematical elegance is insufficient, and physical mechanism must also be accounted for. The Moraga Observatory,
established in northwestern Iran in 1259, just after the Mongol sack of Baghdad, which the Islamic intellectual tradition survived and in some ways reconstituted, was perhaps the most sophisticated astronomical institution of the medieval world.
Staffed by scholars from across the Islamic world, and even including a Chinese astronomer, it maintained systematic observations over decades and produced astronomical tables of unprecedented accuracy. The models of planetary motion developed at Maraha were, it has been argued by historians of science, direct precursors to the mathematical techniques that Copernicus used in the 16th century when he proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system.
Copernicus, whose work is often presented as the revolutionary starting point of modern astronomy, may have had access to Maraga observatory work through routes that historians are still tracing. The mathematical techniques are similar enough, in some cases identical enough, that independent invention is not the only explanation. The stars were named, the year was measured, the Earth's tilt was calculated, the defects in ancient models were identified, the instruments were refined.
The observations were taken night after night, season after season, year after year, from observatories built specifically for the purpose, by scholars who understood that the sky was a subject that rewarded long and patient and careful attention. Look up tonight if the sky is clear. Every Arabic name you know for what you see up there, every Aldebaran, every Mega, every Betelgeuse, is a small piece of that tradition.
A label placed on the darkness by someone in Baghdad or Damascus or Moraga who looked up at the same darkness you are looking at now, named what they saw, and wrote it down so that you would still have the name, still watching the same sky, still using their words for it. The practical application of Islamic astronomical knowledge was not limited to religious observance, though that remained a central motivation.
Islamic astronomy was also the foundation of navigation, of geography, of the precise measurement of time, and of the calendar calculations that governed the planting and harvesting of crops across the agricultural heartland of the Islamic world. The determination of the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, which Muslims were required to face during prayer, from any location on earth, was a mathematical problem of the first order.
To solve it correctly required knowing the latitude and longitude of both the observer's location and Mecca, and then solving a spherical trigonometry problem to find the great circle direction between them. Islamic mathematicians developed the spherical trigonometry required for this calculation, producing mathematical tools that had not existed in the Greek tradition, and that became foundational for European mathematics when they were eventually transmitted westward. Al-Battani's improvements to the astronomical measurements he inherited from Ptolemy were not merely incremental.
He discovered that Ptolemy's figure for the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of stars to shift gradually over centuries, was incorrect. He calculated a more accurate value. He determined the inclination of the ecliptic with greater precision than any previous measurement. He refined the calculation of the moon's main motion. In every major parameter of the Ptolemaic astronomical system that he checked, he found the Greek measurement wanting and produced a better one.
This was systematic improvement of the inherited body of knowledge through sustained, careful, repeated observation. Not brilliance in the sense of a sudden individual insight, but brilliance in the sense of the discipline and precision and honesty required to go back to the instruments night after night, year after year, and check the numbers, and correct them when they were wrong, and check them again. Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, whom we have already encountered as a geographer, was also one of the most accomplished astronomers of the Golden Age.
His Kitab al-Qanun al-Masudi, the Canon of Masud, was a comprehensive astronomical treatise that addressed not only the Ptolemaic model, but also, remarkably,
the question of whether the Earth moved or was stationary. Al-Biruni did not commit to the heliocentric position. He lived 3 centuries before Copernicus, and in the absence of evidence that definitively resolved the question, he was appropriately cautious. But he noted that the mathematical description of the observed movements of the planets would be simpler if the Earth moved around the Sun than if the Sun moved around the Earth.
He raised the question with full awareness of its implications. He left it open. The fact that he raised it at all in the 11th century using the right mathematical reasoning is not a small thing. The observatories that Islamic astronomy built were also significant achievements of architecture and instrumentation. The observatory at Maraha, established in the 1250s, included instruments of a size and precision that had not previously been constructed. A mural quadrant, a fixed stone arc used for measuring the altitude of celestial objects, with a radius of approximately 3 meters.
Other instruments on similarly impressive scales. The larger the instrument, the more precisely you can read it. And Maraga's astronomers were committed to precision. Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, the director of Maraga, made 2 major contributions that historians of science regard as significant precursors to the Copernican revolution. The first was the Tusi couple, a mathematical device for generating linear motion from circular motion, which allowed planetary models to maintain the perfect circles that Aristotelian cosmology required, while still accurately describing the observed movements of the planets.
The second was a systematic critique of the Ptolemaic model's internal inconsistencies, of which there were several serious ones, and a reconstruction of planetary theory on more rigorous mathematical foundations. Ibn al-Shatir, working in Damascus in the 14th century, went further. He developed mathematical models for the movements of the Moon and Mercury that achieved accuracy superior to Ptolemy's while using only uniform circular motions, solving a problem that had troubled astronomers for 15 centuries.
His lunar model is, as historians have noted with considerable interest, mathematically identical to the model that Copernicus used in his own treatment of the Moon in the 16th century. Identical, not similar, identical. This does not prove direct transmission. It is possible that Copernicus arrived at the same mathematical formulation independently. But
the mathematical likelihood of 2 people inventing the same novel geometric construction independently in different centuries, without any connection, is low enough that most historians of astronomy now consider some route of transmission to be probable, even if its exact path has not been fully traced. The sky above Baghdad was the same sky above Copernicus's Prussia. The same stars, the same movements, the same mathematical problem waiting to be solved. The Baghdad astronomers got there first, and the names they gave the stars are still the names we use.
Which means that tonight, if you go outside and look up and name what you see, Altair, Aldebaran, Rigel, Vega, you are speaking Arabic into the dark, speaking the language of the House of Wisdom, speaking the names that the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age gave to the things they looked at carefully and thought it was worth naming. Still up there, still the same stars, still answering to the same names. In the year 1206, a man named Ismail al-Jazari completed a book.
He called it Al-Jami Bain al-Ilm wal-Amal al-Nafi fi Sinat al-Hiyal, the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. It described, with detailed illustrations and construction instructions, 50 mechanical devices that al-Jazari had either invented or significantly improved over a career spent as chief engineer to the Artukid rulers of Diyarbakir, in what is now southeastern Turkey. The devices included water clocks of extraordinary complexity, hand-washing machines that operated automatically, fountains that changed their pattern by themselves, musical automata that played instruments without human intervention, a boat carrying 4 mechanical musicians who performed continuously,
and the one that most consistently stops historians of technology in their tracks, a programmable musical robot band. The word robot did not exist in 1206. Neither did the concept in any modern sense.
And yet, what Al-Jazari built was, by the technical definition, a programmable automaton, a mechanical device whose behavior could be changed by altering a physical configuration rather than rebuilding it entirely. The musical boat contained 4 mechanical figures, 2 drummers, a harpist, and a flautist, whose performance could be altered by repositioning pegs on a rotating cylinder. Different peg positions produced different rhythmic patterns. You could change the music by changing the pegs. This is, in the most literal sense, a program.
A physical program, implemented in pegs and cylinders rather than in code, but a program nonetheless. A set of instructions stored in a physical medium that determined the behavior of a machine when executed. The first programmable automaton, 1206, in Diyarbakir. Al-Jazari's water clocks deserve their own moment. The elephant clock, described in the Book of Knowledge and illustrated in manuscripts that survive, was a timekeeping device of remarkable mechanical ingenuity. Every half hour, a series of mechanical events
Occurred in sequence. A ball dropped from a serpent's mouth into the open jaws of a dragon. The dragon's weight caused the serpent to bow. A figure on top of the elephant struck a drum. A phoenix rotated. A scribe on the elephant's back moved to point at a new time marker. All of this was driven by a float inside the elephant's body, rising as water flowed in from a hidden reservoir, with a carefully calibrated hole ensuring the flow rate was precise. Precise enough over a 12-hour period to keep accurate time.
The elephant clock also made a philosophical statement. Its design incorporated elements from 5 different cultures: Indian, the elephant; Persian, the mechanical dragon; Egyptian, the phoenix; Chinese, the timing mechanism style; and Arab, the scribe figure. Al-Jazari built into the physical object of his most famous clock a statement about the multicultural synthesis that had produced it. The device could not exist without Indian mechanical traditions, without Persian automata, without Chinese timekeeping methods, without Arab mathematical and engineering knowledge. This was not coincidence. Al-Jazari lived in a world where these traditions had been converging for 4 centuries in the House of Wisdom and its successors. He was the product of that convergence, and the elephant clock was his way of making that intellectual genealogy visible.
The Book of Knowledge was copied extensively after Al-Jazari's death. Illustrated manuscripts survive in multiple libraries across the world, in Istanbul, in Cairo, in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, in various collections in the United States. The illustrations in these manuscripts are extraordinary, detailed enough to serve as actual engineering drawings, showing the internal mechanisms of devices with the cutaway precision of a technical manual. They are beautiful objects, these manuscript pages. The illustrations combine functional accuracy with artistic care in a way that reflects Al-Jazari's understanding that beauty and usefulness were not competing values.
He said so in the book's introduction. He wrote that he had tried to make the devices beautiful as well as functional because he believed that craftsmanship required both, that an object made with skill should also be made with care for its appearance, that the engineer and the artist were not different people. The Islamic Golden Age produced numerous other engineers and inventors whose work does not receive the attention it deserves. Abbas ibn Firnas of 9th century Cordoba built a mechanical planetarium that could simulate the movements of celestial bodies, created a type of glass from rock crystal, devised a method for manufacturing colorless glass, and, most famously, most adventurously,
most consequentially for the history of very ambitious personal choices, attempted human flight. He designed a frame covered with feathers and silk, climbed to a high point, jumped, and reportedly achieved a sustained glide before landing badly due to not having fought through the tail component that birds use to brake.
He was reportedly in his 70s at the time. He survived. The first human attempt at mechanical flight, Cordoba, Spain, 875 CE. He survived. Al-Jazari would have understood. The best engineers always try the thing, even before they are entirely sure it will work. That is, when you think about it, the only way anything gets built.
Al-Jazari's achievement exists within a tradition of mechanical ingenuity that the Islamic Golden Age inherited from the ancient Greek engineer Hero of Alexandria, who had himself built mechanical automatas, steam-powered devices, and programmable fountains in the 1st century CE, and dramatically extended. Between Hero and Al-Jazari, there had been a tradition of mechanical engineering in the Islamic world that produced water clocks, fountains, and automata of increasing complexity, building toward the sophistication that Al-Jazari represents.
The Banu Musa brothers, 3 brothers, sons of a mathematician working in Baghdad in the 9th century, produced a book called Kitab al-Hiyal, the Book of Ingenious Devices, which described approximately 100 mechanical devices, including trick vessels that could serve wine and then water from the same spout, self-trimming oil lamps, and various water-driven mechanical systems. They were Al-Jazari's predecessors in a direct intellectual line, their book one of the sources he drew on and acknowledged.
What Al-Jazari did that the Banu Musa had not was take the engineering from demonstration to full technical description. The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices is not a book of marvels, it is a book of instructions. For each device, Al-Jazari describes not only what it does and why it is impressive, but how to build it. The materials required, the dimensions, the mechanical principles, the sequence of assembly, the calibration required for correct operation. He expected readers to build the things he described.
This makes his book a work of engineering documentation in the modern sense, not a curiosity cabinet of mechanical wonders for a ruler's amusement, but a technical manual designed to transmit practical knowledge. The fact that it is also beautiful, illustrated with miniature paintings of remarkable quality that show the devices in cross-section and in operation, the colors still vivid after 800 years in the manuscripts that survive, reflects Al-Jazari's stated philosophy that beauty and function were inseparable values in good craftsmanship.
The crankshaft is worth dwelling on as an example of what Al-Jazari's engineering actually represented. The crankshaft, a mechanical component that converts rotary motion to reciprocating linear motion, or vice versa, is one of the most fundamental components of modern machinery. Every internal combustion engine contains one. Every piston pump contains one. The mechanical loom, the flour mill, the textile factory, the automobile engine all depend on the crankshaft principle. Al-Jazari described a form of this mechanism in his treatment of water-raising machines.
The first unambiguous depiction of a crank mechanism in the Latin West comes from several centuries after Al-Jazari. The double-acting pump, similarly. The principle that a pump with 2 cylinders working alternately on a shared shaft produces continuous rather than intermittent flow is exploited in every modern reciprocating pump. Al-Jazari described this in the 13th century. European pump engineering would take centuries to develop independently to the same point. The weight of historical evidence suggests that Islamic mechanical knowledge influenced European mechanical development through routes we have not fully traced,
in the same way that Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge influenced European mathematics and astronomy through routes that are considerably better documented. The mechanisms are too similar, appearing in European contexts too shortly after they appear in Islamic engineering texts that were certainly circulating in translation, for pure coincidence to be entirely comfortable. But even setting the question of influence aside, Al-Jazari's achievement stands on its own terms. He built things. He documented how to build them.
He trained craftsmen in his workshop. The devices existed. The elephant clock told time and moved its figures and struck its drum at the appointed hours. The musical automata played. The double-acting pump pumped water continuously from a river. Engineering is real in a way that theory is not.
And the test of an engineering achievement is not peer review, but performance. Al-Jazari's machines performed. We know this because he described the testing and adjustment required to make them perform. The calibration of the water flow in the clocks, the tuning of the musical mechanism, the seating of the pistons in the pump. He describes problems he encountered and how he solved them. He sounds, in these passages, exactly like what he was, an engineer, solving problems, building things, making them work. 800 years ago. In 1154 CE, a geographer and scholar named Muhammad al-Idrisi completed the most accurate map of the world that had ever been made. He called his work Nuzat al-Mushtaq fi Ikhtirak al-Afaq, the Book of Pleasant Journeys into Faraway Lands, though it is more commonly known simply as the Tabula Rogeriana, because it was produced at the court of King Roger II of Sicily, who had commissioned it. Al-Idrisi was a Muslim scholar working for a Christian Norman king on a Mediterranean island that was, at the time, one of the most culturally mixed places in the world. Sicily under the Normans was simultaneously Latin, Greek, Arabic-speaking, and Jewish. It was the kind of place where a king who wanted the best geographer in the world would hire Al-Idrisi, and Al-Idrisi would accept, because neither party found this arrangement unusual. The map Al-Idrisi produced, after 15 years of work, was made on a silver disc approximately 3.5 meters in diameter, weighing approximately 150 kilograms. It no longer exists. The silver disc was destroyed in a later political upheaval, but the accompanying manuscript, the Tabula Rogeriana, survives, and within it, the world map that Al-Idrisi drew. It is oriented with south at the top. This is the detail that most people notice first when they encounter Al-Idrisi's maps, and that seems, initially, like a curious eccentricity.
But it was not eccentric within the Islamic cartographic tradition, in which south-up orientation was standard, partly reflecting the importance of the direction toward Mecca for a tradition centered in the Arab world, partly reflecting the fact that orientation is fundamentally arbitrary. There is no correct way up for a spherical Earth. North is not intrinsically on top. We put it there because European cartographers in the age of European expansion established the convention, and it became global. Al-Idrisi's tradition put south on top. Rotating his maps by 180 degrees reveals something immediately remarkable. The coastlines of Europe, Africa, and Asia are recognizable. The proportions are wrong in places, but they are wrong in ways that reflect the limits of the geographical information available, not in ways that reflect a failure to understand the shape of the world. Al-Idrisi's map includes accurate representations of the British Isles, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean coast in considerable detail, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. It represents a synthesis of geographical knowledge drawn from classical sources, primarily Ptolemy's geography, which had been translated into Arabic, and from the reports of Arab travelers, traders, and administrators,
whose knowledge of the actual shape of the world was, in many areas, considerably more current than anything the ancient Greeks had recorded. Al-Idrisi sent questionnaires. This detail is worth savoring.
In the 12th century, the principal geographer of the Mediterranean world sent written questionnaires to travelers and traders, asking them to describe the coastlines, rivers, and settlements of the lands they had visited. He cross-referenced the answers. He interviewed people in person. He compared accounts for consistency. He was, in other words, doing something that looks considerably like systematic empirical research in a field, geography, that had previously relied largely on either classical authority or single informant accounts. The Islamic tradition of geography extended well beyond Al-Idrisi.
Ibn Battuta, the 14th century Moroccan traveler, who is to the Islamic world what Marco Polo is to the European world, except that Ibn Battuta traveled approximately 3 times as far, and his account is considerably more reliable. Covered roughly 117,000 kilometers in his lifetime of travel, visiting the equivalent of 44 modern countries. He traveled to Mali, to Constantinople, to India, to China, to the Maldives, to the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa, to the trading ports of the East African coast. He recorded what he saw with the curiosity and precision of someone who understood that the world was interesting precisely in its variety, and that variety was worth describing accurately. His record of 14th century Mali, for example, includes a detailed description of the court of Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire, whose 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, distributing gold so liberally that he reportedly caused an inflation crisis in Cairo, is one of the more extraordinary events in medieval economic history.
Ibn Battuta's account is primary source evidence for a world that has left relatively few other written records. Without his Rila, his travel memoir, the history of 14th century sub-Saharan Africa would be significantly less documented.
Earlier Islamic geographers had been mapping and describing the world since the 9th century. Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, had traveled from the Atlantic coast to China and produced geographical and historical works of remarkable scope. Al-Biruni, working in the early 11th century, went with Mahmud of Ghazni's armies to India and produced a comprehensive account of Indian culture, science, religion, and geography, the Tariq al-Hind, the history of India, that remains one of the most important medieval sources for the study of Indian civilization.
He described Indian scientific and mathematical knowledge with genuine respect and intellectual engagement, identifying the places where Indian mathematics exceeded what was known in the Islamic world, and learning from it. Al-Biruni also calculated the radius of the Earth using a method he devised that required only a measurement of the height of a mountain and the angle of the horizon from its summit, and simple trigonometry. His method was elegant, practical, and could be performed by a single observer with relatively simple equipment. His result was 6,339.9 kilometers. The modern value is 6,371 kilometers. His error was
0.5%, with a mountain and some trigonometry. The Islamic cartographic and geographic tradition mapped the world not as it was imagined to be, as so much ancient geography had done, filling unknown regions with monsters and legends and moral lessons, but as it actually was, or at least as close to that as systematic inquiry and honest reporting could achieve. When the reports of travelers contradicted the classical sources were questioned, rather than the travelers silenced. The world as it is, described accurately.
With south at the top, which is exactly as reasonable as north. Rotate the map. The coastlines are there. The world is recognizable. It always was. Al-Idrisi's method of gathering geographical information was itself a significant intellectual achievement. The tradition of armchair geography,
drawing maps based on what classical authorities had written, filling in blank spaces with inference or imagination, was the dominant approach in most medieval cartographic traditions. Al-Idrisi chose systematic empirical collection instead. He describes in the Tabula Rogeriana's introduction how he proceeded. He gathered groups of travelers and interviewed them.
He asked them specific questions about the distances between places, the nature of the terrain, the location of rivers and mountains, the character of coastlines. He cross-referenced their accounts. Where accounts conflicted, he sought additional informants. Where he had only single informant data for a region, he noted this. A kind of source transparency that is more commonly associated with modern scholarship than with 12th century geography. He also made practical experiments. Where he wanted to test a reported route's accuracy, he would arrange for the route to be retraced and timed.
He used known measurements, the circumference of the Earth as calculated by Islamic
astronomers, as a framework against which to check the consistency of reported distances. He was doing, in other words, something that deserves to be called geographical science rather than geographical scholarship. The result was a map that, when rotated to the north-up orientation that modern eyes expect, shows a world that is recognizably the world. Not perfectly. The proportions of sub-Saharan Africa are off. The details of Scandinavia are imprecise. Southeast Asia is somewhat compressed, but the Mediterranean coastlines are represented with a precision that reflects genuine knowledge of the sea, acquired through centuries of Arab maritime activity. The Arabian Peninsula, the Indian Ocean, the coasts of East Africa, represented with an accuracy that reflects the Arab trading networks that had been operating in these waters since the 7th century. The Islamic world of the Golden Age was a maritime world as well as a land world, and its geography reflected this. Arab merchants had been sailing the Indian Ocean trade routes since before the rise of Islam, and the Islamic Golden Age saw these routes expand dramatically. Arab ships reached India, Sri Lanka, the Malay Peninsula, and China's southeastern coast. The information that came back through merchant networks about coastlines, about ports, about winds and currents, and the depths of channels was incorporated into the geographical tradition. Arab navigators developed the magnetic compass in parallel with or slightly after its development in China, and used it in Indian Ocean navigation from at least the 11th century. They had developed highly accurate astronomical navigation, using the altitude of the pole star to determine latitude, using the positions of other known stars to determine direction, that allowed them to sail confidently across open ocean in ways that most contemporary European navigators would not have attempted. The term for Arab navigational expertise in the Indian Ocean context is sometimes summarized by the figure of Ahmed ibn Majid, the 15th century Arab navigator, who is, by one historical tradition, credited with guiding Vasco da Gama from the East African coast to India on the Portuguese explorer's first voyage.
Whether this account is fully accurate is debated. What is not debated is that Ibn Majid was a real person, a recognized master of Indian Ocean navigation, who wrote detailed nautical guides to the Indian Ocean's winds, currents, and harbors that were comprehensive enough to be useful to anyone navigating those waters. The geographical knowledge of the Islamic world was also institutional. The Abbasid administration required accurate geographical information to manage its enormous territories, distances between cities, capacities of roads, locations of water sources, characteristics of different administrative regions. This practical requirement drove the production of administrative geographies, books that described regions in terms of their cities, their revenues, their roads, and their populations, that were more detailed and more reliably informative than anything produced by any other contemporary political system. Al-Muqaddasi's Ahsan al-Taqasim fi Marifat al-Aqalim, the best divisions for knowledge of the regions, is a 10th century geographical work of remarkable sophistication.
Al-Muqaddasi had actually visited almost every region he described, making his work empirical in the way that most medieval geography was not. He describes the soils of different regions, the crops they support, the industries of their cities, the quality of their bread and water,
The character of their inhabitants, with a dry humor that makes him one of the most entertaining medieval geographers to read. He describes some places he visited as wonderful, some as terrible, some as inexplicably self-satisfied. He visited Baghdad and found it overrated. He thought Basra was better. He is the only medieval geographer I am aware of who publicly preferred somewhere else to Baghdad, which took a certain confidence in his own geographical judgment.
The maps that survive from the Islamic cartographic tradition are some of the most beautiful objects that the Golden Age produced. Illuminated manuscripts in which the geographical information is presented in a visual form of remarkable elegance. The coastlines drawn with a flowing precision, the cities marked with their names in neat calligraphy, the seas colored in rich blues and greens, the mountains indicated with hatching or stylized peaks. They are working documents that are also works of art in the tradition of the Islamic Golden Age that did not regard these as competing values.
South at the top, the world as it is, accurate within the limits of what was knowable. Rotated, the coastlines are there. They always were. Section 7. What they ate, drank, and grew in the Golden Age. The food of the Islamic Golden Age is one of the most underappreciated aspects of a civilization that tends, in popular imagination, to be represented almost entirely by its intellectual achievements, rather than by what its people actually ate for dinner. This is a mistake.
What people eat tells you things about a civilization that books of mathematics and astronomy do not. It tells you what they valued, what they imported, what they grew, what they could afford, what they cooked for celebration, and what they cooked for ordinary days. It tells you how they understood the relationship between food and health. It tells you who was in their kitchens and whose recipes they were following. The cuisine of the Islamic Golden Age was, to put it directly, extraordinary.
The medieval Arab cookbooks that survive, and several do survive in varying states of completeness, describe food of a sophistication, variety, and culinary intelligence that bears no resemblance to the sparse and monotonous diet that popular imagination tends to project onto medieval people everywhere.
The earliest surviving Arabic cookbook, Kitab al-Tabik, the Book of Dishes, was compiled in the 10th century, drawing on culinary traditions from Persia, Arabia, and the wider Islamic world. It contains recipes for dishes that combine sweet and sour, spiced and fragrant, in ways that reflect a culinary philosophy of deliberate flavor complexity. The use of rose water in cooking, the combination of meat with dried fruit, rice dishes perfumed with saffron, pastries soaked in honey and flower water, dishes that required patient preparation over hours, specific ingredients carefully chosen, techniques that revealed a cooking tradition of long refinement.
A 13th century cookbook from Baghdad, the Kitab al-Wusla ila al-Habib, the Book of the Bond with the Beloved, contains several hundred recipes covering a vast range of dishes, preservation methods, and preparations. It describes marinades and brines, meat preserved in fat, vinegars flavored with herbs, confections made from sugar. And here is something worth registering, because sugar, in the form familiar to us today, was largely an Islamic and Arab world product until well into the medieval period. The Islamic world had developed sugarcane cultivation and the refinement of sugar from cane into the crystalline substance we use, and had built a sophisticated confectionery tradition on this foundation. The sweets described in medieval Arab cookbooks are not simple. Lauzinage, a marzipan-like confection made from ground almonds and sugar. Coheria, elaborate sugar sculptures used as display pieces at great feasts. Mulabia, a rice pudding perfumed with rose water that has survived in recognizable form to the present day. Baklava, in an early form. Pastries filled with nuts and honey and sealed with various techniques.
The Islamic confectionery tradition contributed substantially to what became the dessert cultures of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The Islamic world was also the primary conduit for spices flowing from South and Southeast Asia to Europe during the Golden Age period. The spice trade, cinnamon, pepper, cardamom, cloves, nutmeg, passed through Islamic merchant networks across the Indian Ocean, through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, into the markets of Cairo and Baghdad and Cordoba, and from there into Europe. Islamic merchants did not merely transmit these spices, they used them.
Medieval Arab cuisine was spiced with a confidence and knowledge born of direct access to the materials, in contrast to European medieval cooking, which used Eastern spices as precious rarities to be deployed sparingly.
The markets of 10th century Baghdad were legendary in Arabic literature for their variety and abundance. The geographer al-Muqaddasi, writing in the late 10th century, described the markets of Baghdad in terms that suggest a city of extraordinary commercial richness. Streets of spice merchants, streets of book dealers, streets of cloth merchants, streets of food sellers of every description. He complained, in one famous passage, that he found Baghdad confusing because no matter what he was looking for, there was an entire street full of it, and he kept losing his way.
This is a complaint that a certain kind of traveler will recognize as a form of happiness. The Islamic understanding of food and health inherited and considerably extended the ancient Greek tradition of dietary medicine. The idea that food was not merely fuel, but medicine, and that the health of the body was substantially determined by what it ate and in what combination. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine devoted extensive sections to food and diet, categorizing ingredients by their heating or cooling properties, their moistening or drying effects, and prescribing specific dietary regimens for specific conditions and constitutions.
The Islamic tradition also produced the first systematic writings on culinary chemistry, the ways in which combining ingredients changed their properties. Why does cooking in acid change the color of vegetables? Why does salt draw water from meat? Why do different cooking methods produce different textures? These were questions that the medieval Islamic culinary writers were at least beginning to ask, in a tradition that linked kitchen practice to the natural philosophy that was the predecessor of what we now call science. Coffee enters the story somewhat later. The earliest credible accounts of coffee drinking are from 15th century Yemen, slightly after the classical Golden Age period, but within the continuous cultural tradition. Sufi mystics used it to stay awake for night prayers. It spread from Yemen to Cairo to Istanbul. From Istanbul to Vienna, when the Ottoman armies retreated from their siege and left bags of coffee behind, producing the coffee house culture that spread across Europe. The coffee in the cup at your elbow, if you have one, follows a chain of custody that runs through the Islamic world before it reaches you. Which means that tonight, in the small hours, if you are not yet asleep and you are considering whether a warm drink might help, the choice that most suggests itself is also, historically speaking, the most Islamic Golden Age adjacent choice available. The food tells you where you are. It always does. And where you are tonight has more to do with medieval Baghdad than the labels on anything in your kitchen are likely to indicate. The agricultural revolution that accompanied the Islamic Golden Age is one of its most consequential and least celebrated achievements. The Islamic world, spanning from Spain to Central Asia, created conditions for the movement of crops, irrigation techniques, and agricultural knowledge across a vast connected territory in ways that permanently transformed the food production of both hemispheres. The historian Andrew Watson documented what he called the Islamic Green Revolution, the transfer of crops from South Asia and tropical Africa into the Mediterranean world through Arab merchant and administrative networks during the Golden Age period.
Hard wheat, sorghum, rice, sugarcane, cotton, watermelon, eggplant, spinach, artichokes, sour oranges, lemons, limes, bananas, plantains, mangoes, and coconut palms all moved westward through the Islamic world during the 8th through 13th centuries, transforming the agricultural palette of the Mediterranean and eventually of Europe. These were not trivial additions. Hard durum wheat, the wheat used for pasta, was introduced to the Mediterranean from Central Asia through Islamic agricultural networks and became the basis of an entirely new category of food that would eventually define Italian cuisine. Sugarcane, introduced to the Mediterranean from its origins in tropical South Asia via Persia and then the Arab world, transformed the European diet by making sugar available in quantities that had previously been impossible, and created the sugar industry that would eventually drive the tragic Atlantic plantation economy. Rice, cultivated in irrigated fields across the Islamic world from Spain to Iran, expanded the caloric base available to millions of people. The agricultural manuals that Islamic scholars produced were as systematic and empirically grounded as their medical and astronomical texts.
Ibn al-Awam's Kitab al-Filaha, the Book of Agriculture, written in 12th century Andalusia, described the cultivation of over 580 plant varieties and the husbandry of numerous animal species, drawing on both classical sources and empirical observation in a synthesis that reflected the same intellectual approach as the medical and mathematical encyclopedias of the period. The irrigation systems developed across the Islamic world during the Golden Age were engineering achievements on the same scale as the Roman aqueducts, less dramatically visible, but no less technically sophisticated.
Qanat systems, which we explored in the context of ancient Persia, were maintained and expanded across Iran and Central Asia under Islamic administration. Noria water wheels, devices for lifting water from rivers, were built at scales and in configurations that allowed the irrigation of vast areas of otherwise dry land. The plains of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, were transformed by Arab irrigation engineers from dry upland into productive agricultural land, whose productivity the subsequent Christian kingdoms maintained for centuries, precisely because the infrastructure was too good to abandon.
The cultural dimensions of Islamic Golden Age food culture were sophisticated in ways that our modern picture of medieval life tends not to accommodate. There was a food criticism tradition. Medieval Arab authors wrote about food with the discriminating attention that we associate with modern restaurant reviews. They debated the relative merits of different preparations of the same dish. They described the appropriate pairing of foods. They wrote about the aesthetics of presentation and the social dynamics of the table, with a specificity that reflects a culture in which eating well was considered a legitimate intellectual and aesthetic pursuit, rather than a mere bodily necessity. The great philosopher-physician Ibn Rushd, Averroes in the Latin West, whose commentaries on Aristotle were the primary means by which Aristotelian philosophy re-entered European intellectual life in the 12th and 13th centuries, also wrote about diet and health in ways that reflected the intimate connection in Islamic Golden Age thinking between food, medicine, and philosophy. What you ate was a medical question. It was also a philosophical question about how to live well. It was also a social question about hospitality and generosity and the proper expression of abundance.
The Islamic world's relationship with hospitality, the duty to feed guests, the honor attached to generous provision, the shame attached to inadequate provision, was not merely cultural sentiment. It was a framework that governed the social uses of food in ways that shaped both cuisine and social life. The feast as political statement, the meal as demonstration of values, the kitchen as the site where abstract commitments to generosity became concrete. These were as true in 10th century Baghdad as they had been in Cyrus the Great's Persia. The food knew where it came from.
It always does. Section 8. The women scholars nobody talks about. The names are there in the manuscripts, if you know how to look. The Islamic Golden Age produced, as we have been exploring, scholars of extraordinary range and achievement in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and engineering. The names most commonly associated with these achievements are male names: Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, Al-Biruni, Al-Jazari, Al-Idrisi. This is not because the women of the Islamic Golden Age were absent from intellectual life.
It is because the history of scholarship in any era, in any culture, tends to record male achievements more completely than female ones. The documentation was produced by men, in institutional contexts dominated by men, with a set of assumptions about whose work was worth preserving that reflected those institutional contexts. The women are there, less completely documented, more difficult to trace, but there.
The most completely documented female scholarly tradition in the Islamic world of this period is in the transmission of hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, which formed a crucial part of Islamic religious and legal scholarship. The transmission of hadith required verification, establishing chains of reliable witnesses going back to the source, and women were, from the very earliest period of Islamic history, recognized as valid and important links in these chains. The 9th century scholar al-Bukhari, who compiled the most respected collection of hadith, the Sahih al-Bukhari, which remains one of the foundational texts of Sunni Islam, received teachings from numerous female scholars. He is documented as having studied under more than 200 women in the course of his scholarly formation. These were not peripheral figures consulted as a formality. They were primary sources of scholarly authority in a field that was the central intellectual discipline of Islamic civilization.
Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the wife of the Prophet, is the most cited authority for hadith in the entire tradition, a woman at the absolute foundation of Islamic religious scholarship, whose memory, judgment, and scholarship are the ground on which an enormous edifice of religious knowledge rests. Beyond the hadith tradition, women appear in the records of the Golden Age as physicians, as teachers, as poets, and occasionally as patrons and founders of educational institutions.
Rufaida al-Aslamiyya is considered by Islamic medical historians to be the first Muslim nurse, and is described in early sources as having practiced medicine and taught it to others. The specific details of her practice are disputed by historians. The sources are late and not always reliable, but her presence in the tradition reflects a broader reality that women were involved in medical practice during the formative period of Islamic medicine, particularly in what we might now call nursing care and midwifery. The Bimaristan hospitals that we discussed earlier employed female medical staff.
The records are incomplete, but references in medical texts and administrative documents to female practitioners attending female patients are common enough to establish that this was standard practice rather than exceptional. In 10th century Cordoba, the Andalusian capital of Islamic Spain, which was at its height one of the great cities of Europe and the Islamic world simultaneously, women from educated families had access to books and to scholars in ways that are documented in biographical dictionaries of the period.
Lubna of Cordoba was a slave woman who became the personal secretary of Caliph al-Hakam II, managing the royal library, herself copying manuscripts, and possessing a scholarly reputation that the Caliph evidently considered essential to his intellectual court. She wrote poetry, she understood mathematics, she managed an institution of considerable size.
That she was officially a slave is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of this particular story, but her intellectual authority and her function as a scholar are not diminished by the circumstances of her social position.
The Waqf, the Islamic Endowment Institution, allowed wealthy women to found and fund educational and religious institutions as acts of piety. Several significant madrasas, educational institutions, were founded by wealthy women during the Golden Age period, ensuring that women's wealth contributed to the institutional infrastructure of learning. Fatima al-Fihri founded the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, Morocco, in 859 CE, endowing it from her inheritance after the death of her father.
Al-Qarawiyyin is sometimes described as the oldest continuously operating university in the world, a claim that historians debate in its specifics, but that reflects the genuine antiquity and continuity of the institution. A woman founded it, with her own money, in 859. The limitation of what we know about women scholars of the Islamic Golden Age is not primarily a limitation of what happened. It is primarily a limitation of what was recorded, in what level of detail, and in what kind of document.
The biographical dictionaries that are the main source for information about scholars of the period were enormous compilations, some containing entries on thousands of scholars. They include women. Fewer than the men, significantly fewer, but they include them. The women are in the manuscripts, waiting for historians who are looking carefully enough. They have been there all along. The figure of Fatima al-Fihri deserves more than the passing mention that most accounts give her. She was born in Tunisia in the early 9th century, the daughter of a successful merchant from the city of Fez in Morocco.
When her father died, he left substantial wealth to both Fatima and her sister Miriam. Both women used their inheritances to found religious and educational institutions in Fez. Miriam founded the Andalusian Mosque. Fatima founded the mosque and madrasa complex that grew into the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. She personally supervised the construction, reportedly fasting throughout the building period as an act of devotion, and broke her fast on the day the complex opened. She remained associated with the institution throughout her life.
Al-Qarawiyyin began as a madrasa, a place for the study of Islamic religious sciences, primarily jurisprudence, theology, and the sciences related to the Quran and Hadith. Over the following centuries, it expanded its curriculum to include grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, and astronomy, the classical Islamic educational curriculum that paralleled the European 7 liberal arts in some respects, but was organized differently. It attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, and in the later medieval period, from Europe as well.
The claim that Al-Qarawiyyin is the oldest continuously operating university in the world is contested in its specifics by historians who point out that the modern university as an institution, with its formal degrees, its organized faculties, its institutional continuity over centuries, developed gradually from earlier educational forms that do not always map cleanly onto modern definitions. But Al-Qarawiyyin has been continuously operating as an educational institution since 859 CE, which is a fact independent of exactly what we call it. It still exists. It is still teaching. Students have been attending it for over 11 centuries. A woman founded it. The Andalusian context that produced Fatima al-Fihri and her sister was particularly notable for the degree of female participation in public intellectual life that it permitted. Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, at its height in the 10th and early 11th centuries under the Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba, was a multi-religious society of considerable cultural sophistication, where the boundaries between Muslim, Jewish, and Christian intellectual life were more permeable than almost anywhere else in the medieval world. Jewish women scholars in Islamic Spain were able to study Hebrew religious texts in contexts that their counterparts in other regions would not have had access to. Christian women in the Mozarabic tradition maintained their own scholarly and religious life
within the Islamic political framework.
The cultural mixing of Al-Andalus, the convivencia, the coexistence, imperfect and contested but real, created conditions in which the strictest versions of gender segregation and intellectual life were sometimes relaxed by practical necessity and cultural contact. The biographical dictionaries of Islamic Spain, which are one of the primary sources for information about scholars of the period, record women as hadith transmitters, as teachers, as poets, and occasionally as jurists. The number is small relative to the men recorded, but the women are there, named, with their scholarly genealogies traced, with their intellectual contributions noted.
The women who copied manuscripts deserve specific mention. The scribes who reproduced books in medieval Islam were often female, particularly in households where literate women copied texts for private use or as acts of piety. The manuscripts that preserve the Islamic Golden Age's knowledge were produced partly by women's hands. The ink on the pages was sometimes placed there by women. The texts were transmitted partly through female chains of custody, daughters who learned to read from their scholar fathers, who copied texts, who taught their own daughters.
The chain of knowledge is never made of one kind of link. The final and perhaps most important point about women and the Islamic Golden Age is this. The restrictions that limited women's participation in public intellectual life in the medieval Islamic world were not uniform, not static, and not absolute. They varied by region, by period, by social class, by the specific scholarly tradition in question. In some contexts, in some periods, in some places, women participated in the Islamic Golden Age's intellectual life to a degree that deserves honest recognition. Not as a claim that the medieval Islamic world was gender equal, which it was not, but as a correction to the assumption that women were entirely absent from the story. They were not absent. They are in the manuscripts. They have always been in the manuscripts. Section 9. The night the Mongols turned the Tigris black with ink. In February 1258, the Mongol army of Hulagu Khan reached Baghdad. Hulagu was the grandson of Genghis Khan, leading the Ilkhanate division of the Mongol Empire on a campaign of western expansion that had already destroyed Persia and absorbed it into Mongol administration. Baghdad was the next target, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the capital of the Islamic world, in the most direct political sense, the city of 1 million people, the city with the house of wisdom. The Caliph al-Mustasim, the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, a figure about whom history has not been particularly kind, partly because his judgment during the crisis appears to have been poor, and partly because losers generally receive less sympathetic historical treatment than winners, refused to submit. He reportedly rejected Hulagu's demands with a confidence that the military situation did not entirely support. He did not send reinforcements he might have summoned. He did not evacuate the city's most precious contents when he still had time. The Mongol siege began on January 29, 1258. Baghdad's defenses fell within days. The city was stormed on February 10th. What followed was one of the most devastating acts of urban destruction in the medieval world. The Mongols killed an enormous number of the city's inhabitants. Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million dead, numbers that may be exaggerated in the sources, but that reflect the evident catastrophic scale of the massacre. The caliph was executed, reportedly wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, the Mongols being unwilling to spill royal blood directly on the ground, a protocol that managed to combine murderous intent with a certain elaborate politeness. The palaces burned, the mosques burned. The city that had been the intellectual capital of the world for 4 centuries burned, and the books went into the Tigris. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe the river running dark with ink from the manuscripts thrown into it. This image, the river black with the dissolved ink of a civilization's knowledge, has become the central symbol of the sack of Baghdad in historical memory, the image that encapsulates the scale of what was lost. Hundreds of thousands of volumes from the House of Wisdom and the libraries of private scholars and institutions across the city, representing 4 centuries of translated, original, and annotated scholarship, thrown into the water, or burned, or simply destroyed in the chaos. The loss was real. It would be dishonest to minimize it.
Some of what was in those libraries was truly lost. Texts that had no copies elsewhere. Original works whose ideas died with the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate removed the primary institutional patron of the Islamic intellectual tradition. Baghdad did not recover as an intellectual center. It did not return to anything like its former position. And yet, the Islamic intellectual tradition did not end in 1258, because the knowledge had not been contained in one city. 4 centuries of intellectual work had been copied and recopied and distributed across the vast geography of the Islamic world, from Cordoba in Spain to Samarkand in Central Asia to Cairo in Egypt.
Individual scholars who had studied in Baghdad had taken their knowledge with them when they traveled or relocated. The students of scholars killed in the sack had already dispersed across the Islamic world. The books that had been copied and sent to libraries in other cities were not in the Tigris. The Mariga Observatory, established in 1259, the year after the sack, continued the astronomical tradition. Cairo became an increasingly important intellectual center. The Mamluk Sultanate that ruled Egypt maintained scholarly institutions.
Timbuktu in Mali developed into a center of Islamic scholarship, with libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, many of which survive today in private collections and institutional archives. Iran rebuilt. Central Asia maintained its scholarly traditions. The 13th and 14th centuries saw continued significant achievements in Islamic scholarship, in optics, in mathematics, in history and geography, in religious and philosophical thought. Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century, produced the Muqaddimah, the Introduction to History, which is widely regarded as the first systematic work of what we would now call sociology and philosophy of history.
He proposed that the rise and fall of civilizations followed patterns that could be analyzed rationally, that history was not merely a sequence of events, but a subject that could be studied through the identification of underlying causal processes. He was, in the 14th century, doing something that European social science would not arrive at until the 18th or 19th century. The sack of Baghdad was a catastrophe, a genuine, irreversible, historically significant catastrophe. Some of what was lost that February was lost forever.
But the civilization that produced the House of Wisdom was not contained in the House of Wisdom. It was contained in the minds and the habits and the values and the methods of the scholars who had been formed by it. And those scholars and their students and their students' students were scattered across half the world.
Shires were rebuilt. The observation continued, the night after and the night after that, and every night since. Someone was always looking at the sky. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 was not the first catastrophe to strike the Islamic intellectual tradition, and understanding how it survived requires understanding how the tradition had survived earlier disruptions. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, had created a period of sustained warfare in the Levant that disrupted the Eastern Mediterranean connections of the Islamic world. Cities were taken, scholars were displaced, institutions were damaged.
The Crusader presence in the Holy Land lasted nearly 2 centuries before Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 and the eventual elimination of Crusader states in the Levant by the end of the 13th century. Throughout this period, Islamic intellectual life continued, sometimes in the affected regions themselves, more commonly in cities beyond the immediate conflict zone. Cairo, Cordoba, Baghdad, and the cities of Persia and Central Asia continued producing scholarship while the Levant was a war zone. The Crusades also produced, paradoxically, one of the primary channels through which Islamic intellectual knowledge reached Europe.
The contact between Crusader and Muslim scholars, merchants and translators in the cosmopolitan cities of the Levant and in Sicily, which was Norman, Arab, Greek, and Jewish simultaneously, created conditions for intellectual transfer that the political and military hostility between the broader civilizations did not prevent. Knowledge moved through human contact, regardless of what the rulers on either side were trying to do to each other. The Mongol catastrophe of 1258 was on a different scale. The destruction was greater, the displacement more complete, the loss of institutional infrastructure more severe.
The House of Wisdom did not survive. The Abbasid Caliphate did not survive. The population of Baghdad, which had been one of the largest cities in the world, was reduced catastrophically and did not recover for centuries. But the Ilkhanate Mongols who had destroyed Baghdad converted to Islam within a generation. Hulagu's grandson, Ghazan Khan, converted in 1295. The Mongol rulers of Persia became patrons of Persian and Islamic culture. The Maraha Observatory, established in the immediate aftermath of the sack, was itself a Mongol-patronized institution.
The catastrophe and the cultural recovery began, in a certain sense, simultaneously. The eastern cities of the Islamic world, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, had been devastated earlier by Mongol conquests in the 13th century, but they rebuilt. Samarkand in particular, under the Timurid dynasty in the 14th and 15th centuries, became one of the major intellectual centers of the Islamic world, its observatory producing astronomical work of the highest quality, its madrasas attracting scholars from across the Muslim world, its architecture, including the great Registan Square and the Bibi Khanim Mosque, expressing a cultural confidence that belied the century of destruction that had preceded it.
The history of the Islamic Golden Age's survival of catastrophe is also the history of manuscripts. The single most important factor in preserving the knowledge of the Golden Age was the fact that texts had been copied, distributed, and held in collections across an enormous geographic range. A manuscript in Timbuktu survived the sack of Baghdad. A manuscript in Cairo survived the Crusader disruption of the Levant. A manuscript in Cordoba survived the Mongol conquest of Persia.
The geographic distribution of the Islamic world, which had seemed merely a political fact, turned out to be the most important factor in the resilience of its intellectual tradition. Timbuktu is worth dwelling on. The city in what is now Mali, near the Great Bend of the Niger River, developed between the 13th and 16th centuries into one of the major centers of Islamic scholarship in the world. At its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, it had approximately 180 Quranic schools and a university at the Sankore Mosque that attracted students and scholars from across the Islamic world. Its libraries contained, by scholarly estimates, between 100,000 and 700,000 manuscripts at their height, copies of texts from across the Islamic Golden Age tradition, preserved in the dry Sahelian climate. That is, it turns out, excellent for manuscript preservation. Many of these manuscripts survive. They are in private family collections, in institutional archives, in the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu itself.
They are in Arabic, in several African languages, covering Islamic religious sciences, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, and literature. They are the physical residue of an intellectual tradition that extended the Golden Age southward into sub-Saharan Africa and preserved in the desert
what the Tigris had swallowed. The river ran dark. The libraries were rebuilt. The manuscripts survived. And the scholars, wherever they found themselves after the catastrophe, continued to do what scholars do. They read. They wrote. They argued. They looked at the sky. They kept going.
What the Golden Age left behind that you use every day. Tonight, before you sleep, consider the following. The number you are thinking of, any number, is expressed in a system of numerals that reached Europe through the Islamic Golden Age. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, including the zero, without which modern mathematics and therefore modern computing is literally impossible, was transmitted to the Western world through Arabic mathematical texts, through the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age who had inherited it from India and elaborated upon it and passed it on.
The numbers you think with, the zero in every calculation, arrived here via Baghdad. The word algebra is Arabic, al-jarb, from al-Khwarizmi's treatise, the branch of mathematics without which modern physics, engineering, economics, and computer science could not function. Named in Arabic, invented in Baghdad in the 9th century. The word algorithm is also Arabic, also al-Khwarizmi, his name Latinized. The concept that underlies every computer program ever written, the step-by-step procedure for solving a problem, named after a man who worked in the House of Wisdom and wrote a book about arithmetic. The star names we gave at the beginning of the night, Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Vega, Altair, are Arabic. Descriptions left by the astronomers who named and catalogued the stars, whose sky maps formed the foundation of modern astronomical catalogs. The coffee, if you had any tonight, is Arab, developed in Yemen, spread through Islamic merchant networks.
The coffee house as an institution is Islamic. It began in the Middle East and reached Europe through Ottoman cultural influence. The first coffee houses in England in the 17th century were called, without embarrassment or complexity, penny universities, because scholars and merchants and the merely curious sat in them together drinking coffee and talking, which was, in its social function, almost exactly what the scholarly gatherings of the House of Wisdom had been, but with coffee and significantly less systematic organization.
The hospital, as a medical institution rather than a charitable house, in the form that we now expect it to operate, with organized wards, trained physicians, differentiated treatment by condition, and free care for the poor, was developed in the Islamic world. The Bimaristan model preceded the development of equivalent institutions in Europe by several centuries. The surgical instruments that medieval European physicians used were largely designed or described first by Islamic physicians.
The surgical text of Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, Albucasis in the Latin translation, described over 200 surgical instruments, many of which he invented himself, including forceps for delivering difficult births, instruments for removing cataracts, and dental tools for extracting and cleaning teeth. His Kitab al-Tasrif, The Method, was a medical encyclopedia that served as the primary surgical reference in European medical training for 500 years. Catgut sutures for closing wounds after surgery, first described clearly and systematically by al-Zahrawi, still in use in modified form today.
The guitar, from the Arabic kitara, itself from the Greek kithara, but arriving in Europe through Moorish Spain and its Arabic musical tradition, reshaped by Arab luthiers, whose instrument designs became the basis for what European musicians then developed further. The lute, from al-oud, the Arabic instrument, brought to Europe again through the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily, the same routes through which so much of the Islamic Golden Age's knowledge and culture entered the European world.
The distillation apparatus, the alembic, from the Arabic al-anbiq,
developed and refined by Islamic alchemists in the 8th and 9th centuries into a technology capable of producing pure alcohol, essential oils, and perfumes. The perfume industry, in the form in which it has existed for the last 1,000 years, rests on Islamic alchemical contributions. The word alcohol is Arabic, al-kol. The check, from the Arabic sak, a written financial instrument used in the Islamic banking system to avoid the dangers of transporting large amounts of gold and silver across the vast distances of the Islamic world. Medieval Islamic merchants could write a sak in Baghdad and have it honored in Cairo or Cordoba. The word became check in English, through French, through Italian mercantile borrowing from Arab commercial practice. The concept remains unchanged. These are not obscure academic curiosities. These are the operating system of the modern world, or significant parts of it. The mathematics, the astronomy, the medicine, the music, the financial instruments, the very words. Arriving here from Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba and Samarkand, through the 5 centuries when the Islamic world was the intellectual center of the earth. The house of wisdom burned. The books went into the river. The caliph died in his carpet. And the algebra remained. And the algorithm remained. And the star names remained. And the surgical tools remained. And the astronomical tables remained.
And the number 0, the nothing that makes all modern counting possible, remained. Because some things, once thought, cannot be unthought. Once written and read and understood and taught, they live in the minds that receive them, and those minds teach them forward. And the chain continues through every disaster and every destruction and every burning and every flood. The Tigris ran dark in February 1258. By March, someone somewhere was solving an algebraic equation in a method that Al-Khwarizmi had described 4 centuries earlier.
By the summer, astronomers in Cairo and Maraga were taking their nightly observations. By the next generation, Ibn Khaldun was being born in Tunisia, carrying the intellectual tradition forward into the future it belongs to, which is, in the end, the same future you are in tonight. The 0 is in your phone. The algorithm runs your screen.
The star above your roof, if it has a name at all, and many of the brightest ones do, was probably named by someone in Baghdad or Damascus or Cordoba who looked at the same darkness you are looking at now and thought it was worth naming, worth the trouble of looking carefully, worth writing down. Sleep well. The house of wisdom is still open. It never really closed. The path from the Islamic Golden Age to the world you are in tonight is not a metaphor.
It is a historical chain of specific transmissions, specific translations, specific people carrying specific knowledge from one place to another and teaching it to the next generation. The 12th century translation movement in Toledo, Spain, where Christian scholars translated Arabic texts into Latin in mirror image of the 8th century translation movement that had brought Greek texts into Arabic, was the primary channel through which Islamic Golden Age knowledge entered the European intellectual tradition. The scholars who came to Toledo from across Europe to find texts to translate were the same kind of people, motivated by the same kind of curiosity as the scholars who had worked in the House of Wisdom 4 centuries earlier. They wanted to know what was known.
They found that most of what was known was in Arabic, so they learned Arabic and translated it. Gerard of Cremona was the most prolific of these Toledo translators. He translated approximately 87 works from Arabic into Latin, including the Canon of Medicine of Ibn Sina, the Astronomical Tables of al-Battani, the Optics of Ibn al-Haytham, mathematical works of al-Khwarizmi,
and dozens of other texts that became the core curriculum of the emerging European universities.
When the University of Bologna, the University of Paris, and the University of Oxford developed their medical and scientific curricula in the 12th and 13th centuries, the primary texts were Arabic texts in Latin translation, or in many cases, Arabic texts with extensive Arabic commentary in Latin translation. The Arabic commentary mattered as much as the Greek original in many cases. Ibn Rushd's commentaries on Aristotle were so comprehensive and analytically sophisticated that medieval European scholars referred to him simply as the commentator, as though there were only one possible commentator on Aristotle, and he was it.
Thomas Aquinas, one of the defining figures of medieval European Christian philosophy, built his philosophical synthesis partly on Ibn Rushd's analytical framework, reading an Arab philosopher's commentary on a Greek philosopher through a Latin translation in order to construct a Christian theology. The layers of transmission in that sentence alone are enough to make the idea of civilizational purity look like what it is, a fiction. The universities that produced the European Renaissance were built substantially on Islamic Golden Age texts. The astronomy that produced Copernicus used Islamic astronomical tables and instruments and mathematical techniques.
The medicine that produced Vesalius built on Ibn Sina's anatomical knowledge and corrected it. The optics that produced Kepler and Newton's understanding of light built on Ibn al-Haytham's foundational work. When Galileo made his arguments about the primacy of mathematical description and empirical observation over received authority, he was articulating a principle that al-Razi had applied to medicine 3 centuries earlier, that Ibn al-Haytham had applied to optics 4 centuries earlier, that the House of Wisdom scholars had applied to mathematics and astronomy 5 centuries earlier. The scientific revolution did not come from nowhere.
It came from the Islamic Golden Age, through the Toledo translations, through the medieval European universities, through the slow accumulation of translated and then extended and then original work that the European intellectual tradition built over 3 centuries before producing its own flowering. The zero that makes your phone's binary arithmetic possible was developed in India, transmitted through the Islamic Golden Age, translated into Latin in Toledo, adopted by European mathematicians, and eventually implemented in the transistors that run every digital device on Earth. The star named Aldebaran, which may be visible from your window tonight if the sky is clear, was named in Baghdad.
The algorithm your social media platform uses to show you content was named after a man who worked in the House of Wisdom. The algebra your children will learn in school, if they have not already, was developed in the same institution. The House of Wisdom burned in 1258. Its name has been given to libraries, schools, and cultural institutions across the Islamic world and beyond as a way of claiming its legacy. Its actual physical location in Baghdad is uncertain. Archaeologists have not definitively identified its remains, but its contents are everywhere.
The knowledge it gathered, translated, extended, and distributed is in every physics textbook, every medical school, every astronomical catalog, every algebra class, every computer program, every word that has Arabic roots in the English language, which is considerably more of them than most English speakers realize. The building is gone. What it held is here, with you, tonight. You are sleeping in the inheritance of the House of Wisdom. Rest well.